In this video, we're going to create the famous cyberpunk look, and in doing so, you're going to learn how to achieve the cinematic contrast that you see in the cyberpunk genre, which colors to change and which colors to add, and two methods to create the glow or bloom effect you see in some images. Now, the cyberpunk look is defined by the neon lights or any type of light that casts a colorful glow and often saturates the environment with bright, vivid colors. As for the environment, it is most of the time dark and gritty, which helps the colors stand out even more. Now let's switch to our unedited photo and let's create this look. Now, first things first, we're going to change the camera profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Neutral. Adobe Neutral gives us a flatter look and more flexibility in the edit than Adobe Color. Now let's denoise the photo. So scroll down until you see denoise. Now I usually use 20% or 30%, but if you have a super noisy photo, you could go above 50% easily. So in this case, 30% is going to be all that we need. Let's click Enhance and wait for it to process. Now that it's done, let's begin with the tone settings. We're going to increase the contrast to +30 and only +30 because we're going to use the tone curve to dial and refine the contrast later. Next, we're going to bring in the shadows to 70 and the blacks to 40 and drop down the highlights to -55 and the whites to -55 as well. This will prevent the lights from clipping and also reveal some of the detail from the shadows. And don't worry, it's not going to stay this bright in the end. Next, for presence, we want to preserve the details, so we're going to increase the texture to +15 because we're going to decrease the clarity and dehaze to soften the image, which will help us in the end when we're going to create the glow around the lights. So -15 for clarity, and dehaze, we're going to keep it at -10. And vibrance and saturation, we're going to use only vibrance and we're going to give it a +15 value. We don't need any more. Now, before we move to the tone curve tool, we're going to change the temperature and tint as well, which will become two of the most important controls in this whole edit. We're going to shift from a +13 tint to a -15, adding more green in the image. You can go beyond -15, but then you'll have too much green in your photo. So if that's not what you want, stick to -15. As for the temperature, we're going to go to the cooler side. So a 2400 Kelvin is a really good sweet spot, especially for the cyberpunk look. Now, the tone curve tool. We're going to grab the black point and we're going to click on output and set it to 5. And grab the white point. This will also help us with clipping, and drop it to 240. Next, we're going to add 4 points, one right here. This area is between highlights and midtones. Then we're going to add one right where we have the biggest spike in the shadows. Somewhere here. Then we're going to add another one, trying to keep it within the range of the biggest spike right here. And the last one is going to be right where the spike goes up, so at this ramp point. And our contrast is dialed in. Also, this S-curve is one of the most used S-curve, especially for night photos when dialing in the contrast. So you can memorize it and use it every time. Now we can start to change and add colors to our image. Even though this looks really good for a cyberpunk look, it's not 100% there. So let's shift to the green channel. Here, I'm going to press Alt or Option on the keyboard and set a point at this intersection and this intersection on the grid. And at the middle of the grid, I'm going to set another point and drag it down to add purple into the midtones. And I'm going to adjust this one as well. Let's drag it down a little bit and this point right here. Good. Now move to the blue channel to add blues in the shadows. Again, Alt or Option on the keyboard, a point at this intersection. This time we're going to set the second point at the middle intersection. And the third point is going to be right here around the huge spike in the shadows. Click and drag it up to add blues. Perfect. Now let's move on to the HSL sliders. We're going to shift the red hue towards magenta, but just a little bit. So I'm going to dial in -15. Increase its saturation just under 30 because we do not want the reds to be oversaturated, and we're going to lower the brightness, so lower the luminance under -10. This will give us a vivid red, but not a very bright red. Now for orange, I want to move it towards the red spectrum. So I'm going to increase it to around minus 57. Actually, that's too much. So let me go minus 50. That's good. And I want the saturation to be no more than 20 and the luminance no more than 15. Next is yellow. Now, yellow in the Cyberpunk look is usually more greenish in hue, but if you take Cyberpunk portraits, for example, you want the skin tone to be normal or affected just by the light that is in the image, and usually you want to have your yellow sitting in the orange spectrum. So we're going to keep it like the orange at minus 50, and we're going to give it also a 20 saturation and a 15 luminance. And as we can see here in the light, this looks really good. It's not too orange, not too yellow, and it's not that bright. Now for green, usually the Cyberpunk look has a cold green or cooler green. So we're gonna shift the hue towards the right, let's say around plus 20. And we're gonna do the same for saturation and luminance. Next, aqua and blue, two of the most important colors in this type of edit. We're gonna move the aqua more towards the green spectrum and increase its saturation and luminance. Now for blue, I'm just gonna shift it to plus 30 to get the deep blues and a little bit of purple in the image better, and also balance the aqua. Now for saturation and luminance, leave them at 0 because your blues will be affected by the temperature slider when you're gonna use and tweak these settings. Now let's move to purple, where we're going to increase the saturation to 25 and the luminance to 15. We're not going to touch the hue, and we're not going to touch magenta also because we're going to use the color grading tool to do that. So in the color grading tool, we're going to change, usually you're going to have it as a 3-way. We're going to go for individual. So let's select shadows. And here I'm going to go for a deep purple. So a hue of 264, and I'm going to increase the saturation to 30 and decrease the luminance of this tint because the color grading tool basically tints your image. It doesn't infuse the color into the image. So I'm going to drop the luminance to minus 52, somewhere around here, and move to the midtones. Here I'm going to choose a bright magenta. So let's see, somewhere around here. Yeah, that's going to do the trick. And increase this saturation also to 30. And I'm going to increase the luminance this time to right under plus 40. Now for highlights, I want to be around aquas and greens. So a hue of 163, and I'm going to increase the saturation, but only to 25 this time. And the luminance, I'm going to increase it, but keep it under plus 35. Yeah, plus 30 is a good spot. Now blending tells you if the colors are 100% blended with the image or not at all. So you can leave it at 50. I usually tend to increase it to around 60 something. This is not mandatory, but it does help the image. And balance, if you balance to the right, you're gonna balance for the highlights and everything that is bright in the photo. And if you balance to the left, obviously you're gonna balance for shadows and darker areas. So in the Cyberpunk look, the neon lights and every light is the main character. So we're going to balance for the highlights, and I'm going to keep it right under plus 20. If you go above, you see what happens. Now let's move on to the final tool in our coloring process, the calibration tool. Now, what you need to know about the calibration tool is that it affects every color in the image that contains red, green, and blue at a global level. The HSL, for example, affects the colors at a local individual level. See, I changed the blue hue, but the reds don't change at all. But if I change the blue primary in the calibration tool, the reds change as well. So to get the look that you saw in the beginning of the video, we're gonna use the blue hue and move it more towards aqua. Around minus 34 is enough. And we're gonna give it a saturation of 20. Now for green, I'm gonna go more towards yellow and try to match the settings of the blue primary because I want my purples and deep blues back into the photo just a little bit. Also give it a saturation of 20. And for red, I'm just gonna shift the reds towards magenta, but just a little bit. So I'm gonna keep it around minus 10 and increase its saturation to 20 as well. And we're done with the look. Now, the only thing we need to add is the glow around everything that is a light or a reflection of that light. So I'm going to show you two processes, one in Lightroom and one in Photoshop. First, we're going to use the Lightroom one. Go to masking, select background and let Lightroom create the mask. Then scroll down. As you can see, the mask covers the entire image, which is perfect. And under effects, we're going to decrease the clarity to the maximum. And then we're going to tone it down until we get a desired result. So in my case, around -54, -55 is perfect. Now we're going to decrease the clarity as well. So I'm going to just decrease it to around -60 to see what happens. And it gets too soft. We do not want that. So we're going to keep it under -15. As for dehaze, we're not going to use it to soften the image because this happens and we do not need this. Now let's do a quick look before and after. So without the mask, with the mask. Now let me show you the second process of creating the glow. I'm going to disable the mask, create a virtual copy. So right click, create virtual copy. It created two copies because one is the raw photo and one is the one with the edit and the denoise. So we're going to click on the one that is edited and we're going to edit in Photoshop. Now, once you're in Photoshop, select your background, press Ctrl or Command J on the keyboard to create a duplicate, then go to Filter, Other, High Pass, and as a radius, stick between 25 and 50. That's a sweet spot range. I personally prefer 35 for my photos, so click OK. And for those who don't know, High Pass is actually a sharpening filter, but we're going to use the invert of this sharpening to create the glow. So to invert it, just press Ctrl or Command I on the keyboard, set the blending mode to soft light, and if you like this super glowy, super bloomy effect, keep the opacity at 100. I usually prefer to keep it around 65 or 70, and that is all for the glow effect in Photoshop. Now, as a bonus tip, remember when I said in the beginning that the temperature and tint sliders are going to be two of the most important controls in this entire edit? Well, here's why. By slightly adjusting them, you can easily switch between other cyberpunk-inspired looks. And if you want to create this look even faster, there's a free preset in the description for you to download and apply right away. And if you want to create the filmic look, I got you covered in this video.